The sound of a lone harmonica drifted through the dusty main street of Clearwater Springs as Abigail Lawson stood on her porch, clutching the telegram that had shattered her world. "We regret to inform you." The words blurred before her tear-filled eyes as the reality settled in her chest like Lead Thomas would never come home from the war that had claimed so many lives. It was the spring of 1866, 1 year since the war between the states had officially ended, and 1 year since Abigail had begun waiting for her husband's return. The small ranch they'd built together on the outskirts of the Colorado Territory town now seemed impossibly vast and empty without him. "Mrs. Lawson," the postmaster's voice was gentle, "I'm deeply sorry. If there's anything the town can do—" Abigail folded the telegram with trembling fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson, I'll be fine." Her voice betrayed her, cracking on the final word as she turned and walked back into the house that now felt like a mausoleum rather than a home. Inside, Abigail sank to the floor, her back against the rough-hewn door. The telegram fell from her fingers as sobs racked her body. Thomas had been so proud when he'd enlisted in 1863, speaking of duty and honor. They'd only been married 2 years. At 26, Abigail was now a widow with 40 acres of land she couldn't possibly work alone, a small herd of cattle she couldn't manage, and a future as barren as the winter fields. That night, Abigail pulled Thomas's old wool coat around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Stars punctured the velvet darkness above, and the distant howl of a coyote echoed her own desolation. She raised her eyes to the heavens. "What am I supposed to do now, Thomas?" she whispered. The night offered no reply. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the Colorado sky a mocking blue above the struggling ranch. Abigail had barely slept, but she dragged herself from the bed she'd once shared with Thomas. The cattle needed tending regardless of her grief. She was halfway to the barn when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Shielding her eyes against the morning sun, Abigail spotted a rider approaching, tall in the saddle atop a chestnut gelding. The man dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the lean strength in his frame as he walked toward her, leading his horse. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal sun-bleached brown hair and a face weathered by years under the open sky. "Name's Kieran O'Malley. I heard in town you might need some help with your ranch." Abigail straightened, pride stiffening her spine. "News travels fast in Clearwater Springs." "Small towns have small secrets," he replied, a hint of an Irish lilt coloring his words. "I'm looking for work, and you've got a ranch that needs tending. Seems like a fair arrangement." "I can't pay much," Abigail said, studying him. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "I don't need much," Kieran answered. "A place to sleep in your barn and meals would do for now, until you can get back on your feet." "What makes you think I won't get back on my feet on my own?" Abigail challenged, even as she recognized the impossibility of her situation. A small smile tugged at his mouth. "Nothing, madam, but even the strongest need help sometimes." Abigail hesitated, then nodded. "You can start by fixing the fence in the north pasture. The cattle keep breaking through." "Yes, madam," Kieran said, settling his hat back on his head. As he turned to lead his horse to the barn, Abigail noticed the slight limp in his gait. "Mr. O'Malley," she called after him. "Were you in the war?" He paused, his shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. "Yes, madam, Union cavalry." "My husband was with the 1st Colorado Cavalry," she said, her voice flat. "He died at Sand Creek." Kieran turned, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Lawson." "Thank you," she replied automatically, the words as hollow as her heart. "The tools are in the barn." The days stretched into weeks as spring advanced across the Colorado territory. Kieran proved to be a skilled ranch hand, rising before dawn and working until dusk. He fixed fences, tended the cattle, repaired the leaking roof, and even coaxed the old well pump back to life when it threatened to give out entirely. Abigail kept her distance at first, speaking to him only when necessary, giving instructions in a voice still brittle with grief. She spent her evenings alone on the porch, sometimes reading Thomas's letters by lamplight, sometimes just staring into the gathering darkness. One evening, as she sat watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of purple and gold, Kieran approached from the barn, his day's work finished. "Beautiful country," he observed, standing a respectful distance away. "Thomas and I came out here right after we married," Abigail said, surprising herself by volunteering the information. "We wanted to build something that was ours alone." Kieran nodded, his gaze on the distant horizon. "You did. It's a fine piece of land." "It was our dream," she said, pain lancing through her. "Now it's just land." "May I?" Kieran gestured to the empty chair beside her. After a moment's hesitation, Abigail nodded. The wooden chair creaked as he lowered himself into it, stretching his bad leg out before him. "How did you injure your leg?" she asked, seeking a neutral topic. "Antietam," he answered simply. "Took a Confederate bullet. Was lucky many weren't." They sat in silence as dusk settled around them, bringing with it the symphony of night insects and the cool breath of the mountains. "I planted vegetables today," Kieran said finally. "In that patch of ground behind the house. Hope you don't mind." "You planted a garden." Abigail turned to look at him, surprised. "My mother always said growing things helps heal the soul," he replied, a touch of embarrassment in his voice. "Thought it might be good to have fresh vegetables come summer." Something in Abigail's chest loosened slightly at his words. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Thank you." The next morning, Abigail found herself drawn to the small plot behind the house. Neat rows of freshly turned earth marked where Kieran had planted seeds. A crude wooden stake at the head of each row bore the name of what would grow there: carrots, beans, tomatoes, corn. On impulse, she knelt and pressed her fingers into the cool soil. Life would grow here despite everything. The thought brought the first hint of comfort she'd felt in months. When Kieran found her there later, she was weeding around the delicate green shoots that had already begun to emerge. "They'll need water every day in this heat," he said, setting down a bucket he'd filled at the well. Abigail nodded. "I'll see to it." That evening, she invited Kieran to eat at the table inside rather than taking his meal to the barn as had been their custom. The conversation was stilted at first, but as they shared a simple meal of salt pork and beans, Abigail found herself asking about his life before the war. "I came from Ireland as a boy," Kieran told her, his deep voice filling the kitchen that had been silent for too long. "My family settled in Boston, but I never much cared for city life. Headed west when I was 18, worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, did some prospecting in the mountains. And then the war came," Abigail said quietly. Kieran nodded, his eyes distant. "And then the war came." As May turned to June, the garden flourished under their combined care. Abigail found herself watching for the first ripe tomato with an anticipation that surprised her. She began to mark the passing of days not by how long Thomas had been gone, but by the growth of the corn stalks and the changing patterns of wildflowers on the nearby hillsides. Kieran's presence became a comfort rather than an intrusion. His quiet strength and steady work ethic reminded her of Thomas, yet he was his own man, more reserved, with a dry wit that occasionally coaxed a smile from her. One sweltering afternoon, as they worked side by side in the garden, Abigail finally asked the question that had been lingering. "Why did you really come here, Mr. O'Malley? There must be ranches that could pay you proper wages." Kieran sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. "After the war, I drifted, couldn't seem to settle anywhere when I heard about your situation in town. I suppose I recognized something in it." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a long moment. "The war took things from all of us, Mrs. Lawson. Some losses are more visible than others." Before she could ask more, thunder rumbled in the distance. They looked up to see storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "Best get the washing in," Kieran said, rising to his feet with a slight wince. "Looks like a big one coming." The storm broke just as they finished securing the animals and bringing in the laundry that had been drying on the line. Rain lashed against the windows as they took shelter in the house, the small rooms growing dark in the fading light. Abigail lit lamps while Kieran built up the fire in the hearth. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly, how natural it felt to move around the small space together, anticipating each other's needs without speaking. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and Abigail jumped. "Just whined," Kieran said reassuringly. "This house has weathered worse." "Thomas built it strong," she agreed, her voice catching slightly on her husband's name. "He was always good with his hands." Kieran nodded, adding another log to the fire. "Tell me about him," he said quietly. The request surprised her. No one in town ever asked her to speak of Thomas any more, as if mentioning him might shatter her completely. "He was kind," she said hesitantly. "Stubborn. He believed in things with his whole heart, this land, our future together, the Union cause." She swallowed hard. "He wrote me letters every week during the war, beautiful letters about the life we'd build when he came home." "He sounds like a good man," Kieran said. "He was," Abigail replied, then corrected herself. "He is, in my memory at least." The storm raged outside, but inside, as Abigail spoke of Thomas, his dreams, his laugh, the way he'd proposed to her on a hilltop at sunrise, she felt something shift within her. The memories brought pain, yes, but also a warmth she'd forgotten. When she finally fell silent, she realized tears were streaming down her face. Yet they weren't the desperate, wrenching sobs that had plagued her for months. These tears felt cleansing somehow. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting Kieran's gentle gaze, "for listening." "Thank you for sharing him with me," he replied simply. That night, after Kieran had returned to his quarters in the barn, Abigail took out Thomas's letters. For the first time, she read them not with despair, but with gratitude for the love they'd shared, however brief. The summer days lengthened, and with them came a slow, tentative rebirth. The garden yielded its first harvest, sweet carrots and crisp beans that Abigail transformed into stews and preserves for the coming winter. The cattle thrived under Kieran's care, and the ranch began to feel less like a burden and more like the home it had once been. Abigail found herself watching Kieran as he worked the strong line of his shoulders as he chopped wood, the gentle way he handled the new calves, the quiet concentration on his face as he repaired tack in the evenings. She noticed things she hadn't allowed herself to see before: the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the way one corner of his mouth lifted higher than the other when he smiled, the small scar above his right eyebrow. One afternoon in late July, as they worked together to mend a broken wagon wheel, their hands brushed. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through Abigail, and she pulled away as if burned. "I'm sorry," Kieran said immediately, misreading her reaction. "No, Abigail struggled to find words. "It's not your fault." That night she lay awake, troubled by her reaction. The guilt was immediate and crushing. How could she feel anything for another man when Thomas had been gone barely a year? What kind of wife did that make her? When morning came, Abigail was distant, throwing herself into chores and avoiding Kieran's concerned glances. But avoidance proved impossible on the small ranch, and by evening he confronted her gently. "Have I offended you, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked as they finished the evening chores. "No," she replied, unable to meet his eyes. "And please, after all this time, I wish you'd call me Abigail." "Abigail," he said, her name sounding different in his lilting accent. "Something's troubling you." She hesitated, then the words tumbled out. "I feel as though I'm betraying Thomas by moving forward, by finding moments of happiness in a world without him." Kieran was quiet for a long moment. "I knew a soldier during the war," he finally said. "Young fellow from Ohio. Before a battle, he'd always write 2 letters, one to his wife and one to his parents. The letter to his parents was always about how he hoped they'd live fully if he didn't make it home." He looked at her directly. "I didn't know your husband, but I suspect he wouldn't want grief to be the only crop you harvest for the rest of your days." His words stayed with Abigail as summer gave way to autumn. The aspens on the mountainsides turned golden, and the nights grew cooler. Together, they prepared the ranch for winter, stocking firewood, smoking meat, storing the bounty from their garden. Abigail began to venture into town more frequently, no longer avoiding the pitying glances of neighbors. She reconnected with friends, joined the quilting circle, and even attended a harvest dance at the town hall, though she didn't dance herself. Kieran accompanied her to town on these occasions, a steady presence at her side. He'd earned the respect of the townspeople with his hard work and quiet manner. Even Sheriff Miller, who had initially viewed the stranger with suspicion, now greeted him with a friendly clap on the shoulder. On a crisp October day, as they returned from town with supplies, Abigail made a decision. "I'd like to put a proper marker for Thomas," she said as their wagon rumbled along the rutted road. "Not just the wooden cross I made, something permanent." Kieran nodded. "The stonemason in town could make one. Would you help me place it?" "When it's ready, of course," he said simply. 2 weeks later, they stood together on a small rise overlooking the ranch, where Abigail had created a small memorial after receiving news of Thomas's death. The wooden cross she'd fashioned had weathered considerably in the year it had stood. Kieran helped her remove it, then they carefully positioned the new stone marker. The granite headstone was simple but dignified, bearing Thomas's name, the dates of his birth and death, and the words "beloved husband" and "patriot." As they worked, Abigail spoke of Thomas stories she hadn't shared before, memories both joyful and ordinary. Kieran listened, occasionally asking questions that showed he truly wanted to understand the man who had been such an important part of her life. When the marker was properly set, they stood side by side looking at it. "It's a good spot," Kieran said quietly. "He can see the ranch from here." "Watch over it." "Yes," Abigail agreed, tears stinging her eyes. "He would like that." Kieran hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I brought something." He held out his hand, revealing a packet of seeds, wildflowers, thought they might look nice come spring. The simple gesture touched Abigail deeply. Together, they scattered the seeds around the marker, pressing them gently into the soil. As they walked back to the house, the setting sun painted the landscape in warm hues of amber and gold. Abigail felt a curious lightness in her chest, as if something long constricted had finally begun to loosen. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Abigail found herself studying Kieran's profile. He was whittling a small wooden figure, a horse. She thought his large hands surprisingly deft with the small knife. "What will you do when winter comes?" she asked suddenly. He looked up, surprised. "What do you mean, will you stay? Or move on to other work?" Kieran set down his whittling. "I hadn't thought about leaving," he said carefully. "Unless you'd prefer I did." "No," Abigail said quickly. "I don't want you to go." The admission hung between them, fraught with unspoken meaning. "Then I'll stay," Kieran replied simply, "for as long as you need me." "And if I need you for a very long time?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran met her gaze steadily. "Then I'll be here a very long time." The first snow fell in November, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse. Life on the ranch settled into a winter rhythm, tending animals, mending equipment, and long evenings by the fire. Abigail taught Kieran to play checkers, laughing at his exaggerated dismay when she captured his pieces. He taught her Irish folk songs, his deep voice filling the small house with melodies that spoke of distant shores and enduring loves. As Christmas approached, they rode into town together for supplies. The general store was festooned with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and the scents of cinnamon and cloves hung in the air. Mrs. Lawson, Mr. O'Malley, the shopkeeper, greeted them warmly. "Getting ready for the holiday." "Just the essentials, Mr. Wilson," Abigail replied, though her eyes lingered on a display of candied fruits and nuts. As Kieran helped load their purchases into the wagon, Abigail noticed him speaking with the shopkeeper's wife, their heads bent together in conversation. When he rejoined her, she raised an eyebrow questioningly, but he merely smiled. The day before Christmas, Kieran disappeared for several hours. When he returned, his coat was dusted with snow and he carried a small pine tree. "Thought we might bring a bit of the forest inside," he said, a touch of uncertainty in his voice. Together, they set up the tree in the corner of the main room. Abigail found scraps of ribbon and bits of colored paper to decorate it, while Kieran fashioned a star from pieces of tin. That evening, as they sat admiring their handiwork, Kieran produced a small package from his coat pocket. "Merry Christmas, Abigail," he said, offering it to her. She unwrapped it carefully to find a delicate silver locket. Opening it, she discovered a tiny pressed wildflower inside a blue columbine, Colorado's native bloom. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched beyond words. "Mrs. Wilson helped me with it," Kieran explained. "The flower is from the meadow where we placed Thomas's marker." Abigail felt tears well in her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Would you help me put it on?" She turned, lifting her hair as Kieran fastened the slender chain around her neck. His fingers were warm against her skin, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. When she faced him again, something had changed in the air between them. Abigail reached out tentatively, placing her hand against his cheek. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, for everything." Kieran covered her hand with his own. "Abigail," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "It's all right," she assured him, understanding his hesitation. "I know what Thomas would want for me, for us." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Kieran leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, a beginning rather than a demand. When they parted, Abigail saw in Kieran's eyes the same wonder she felt that amid so much loss, they had found each other. The winter passed in a haze of quiet joy. They were cautious with each other, building a foundation of trust and shared work alongside the deepening of their feelings. Kieran moved from the barn into the house, though he kept to the small spare room, respecting Abigail's need to proceed slowly. By spring, when the first green shoots pushed through the snow-softened earth, Abigail knew with certainty that her heart had made room for a new love without diminishing the old. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, she and Kieran visited his marker together. The wildflower seeds they had planted the previous autumn were beginning to sprout, tiny green promises surrounding the stone. "I'll always love him," Abigail said as they stood hand in hand. "He'll always be part of who I am." "As he should be," Kieran replied, squeezing her hand gently. When they returned to the house, Kieran led her to the garden they had planted together the previous year. Fresh furrows had been dug in the rich soil, ready for new seeds. "I've been thinking," he said, suddenly serious. "This ranch is yours and Thomas's." "I don't want to presume," Abigail stopped him with a finger to his lips. "This ranch is where I live," she said firmly. "But you, Kieran O'Malley, are becoming my home." His face broke into a smile that lit his green eyes from within. Dropping to one knee in the freshly turned earth, he took her hand in his. "Abigail Lawson, I've loved you since I saw you standing on your porch, too proud to admit you needed help but too determined to give up. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you care for everything that grows on this land. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." They were married in June, with wildflowers from Thomas's memorial site woven into Abigail's bouquet. The townspeople of Clearwater Springs turned out to celebrate with them, the wedding becoming a community affirmation of life continuing after loss. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, Kieran wrapped his arms around Abigail from behind, both of them gazing at the stars scattered across the velvet sky. "When I first came here," he murmured against her hair, "I was just as lost as you were. The war had left me wandering without purpose." Abigail turned in his arms to face him. "And now I have everything I never dared hope for," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "A home, a purpose, you." She reached up to trace the line of his jaw, marveling at how familiar his face had become to her, how essential. "We'll build something beautiful here," she promised. "Something that honors the past but isn't bound by it." As summer turned to autumn, and autumn to winter, the ranch flourished under their combined care. They expanded the garden, added to the herd, and began repairs on the barn that had weathered too many seasons without attention. Each season brought its own joys and challenges. There were droughts that threatened the crops, harsh winter storms that isolated them for weeks, and the constant hard work that ranch life demanded. Yet through it all, they faced life together, planting seeds both literal and figurative, nurturing growth, and harvesting the fruits of their labor. In their second spring together, as new life erupted all around them, Abigail shared news that brought tears of joy to Kieran's eyes. "A baby," he whispered, placing his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." That evening they walked together to Thomas's marker, now surrounded by a riot of wildflowers in full bloom. Kieran stood back respectfully as Abigail knelt beside the stone. "I wanted you to know," she said softly to the marker. "Life goes on, Thomas. In ways I never imagined when I thought it had ended with you." She touched the granite gently. "Thank you for loving me enough to want that for me." As she rose, Kieran came forward to stand beside her, his hand steady at the small of her back. "He'll always be part of our story," Kieran said. "Just as this land is." Abigail nodded, leaning into his strength. "A story of loss, but also of finding, of endings that become beginnings." Together they walked back toward the house as the setting sun bathed the Colorado landscape in golden light. Behind them, wildflowers nodded in the evening breeze, a living testament to grief transformed by love and the perennial human capacity for hope. The child, a daughter they named Sarah, was born the following winter, a new life in the season of dormancy, a promise that even in the coldest times, growth continues beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to emerge into the light. And as their family grew, so did the ranch, becoming not just a place of work but a true home, one built on shared dreams, mutual respect, and the understanding that love, like the hardy wildflowers on the hillside, can find ways to bloom even in the most unlikely soil.